Bienvenidos a una nueva conversación con el Líbero. Esta vez vamos a hablar de economía, de impuestos, de la situación de Estados Unidos y estamos para esos efectos con un connotado economista de ese país, Dan Mitchell, que hizo su doctorado en economía en George Mason University, fue por muchos años Senior Fellow del Cato Institute allá en ese país también y participó activamente en la discusión pública, ha sido asesor de políticas legislativas, de senadores en Estados Unidos, ha escrito en medios como el New York Times, el Wall Street Journal, el Washington Post, en fin, los principales medios de comunicación de Estados Unidos y también es fundador de el Center for Freedom and Prosperity en ese país, un especialista en temas de impuestos. Así que yo voy a pasar a hablar en inglés ahora con Dan y ustedes podrán, los que tengan el interés de ver esta entrevista también con los subtítulos apropiados. Así que, Dan, welcome and thank you very much for being here with us with El Libero.
Oh, glad to be on the program.
So, Dan, you are an expert on different issues, but especially on taxation. And you speak about this all the time. We have learned a lot from you. I've been following your career for many, many years. You were speaking at several, media programs in the United States, CNN, Fox, everywhere. We are now having this new government. It is a far left government, I would say. It's Gabriel Boric. I know you came to Chile. We actually even met when you were here, seeing what was going to happen with the presidential election. And now they are running the country and they're proposing a tax reform. They want to increase the size of government by 5 percentage points of GDP. And one of the taxes that they want to introduce, and I know you know a lot about this, is the wealth tax. So they want to apply I think it's 0.5% over certain amount of wealth. And I wonder, what can you tell us about the effects that you have observed in different countries that have introduced the wealth tax and what we can learn from Chile in that regard?
Probably the most important thing to understand is that many of the countries in Europe that adopted wealth taxes subsequently got rid of them because they realized that it didn't generate that much revenue and it did a lot of economic damage. And in terms of the economic damage, this is the part that bothers me the most. The key thing to understand is that a tax on wealth takes private capital out of the economy. Now, every economic theory, even socialism, even Marxism, every economic theory agrees that capital formation, saving and investment is a key to long-run growth and higher living standards. So draining capital out of the private sector is an extraordinarily foolish thing to do. And if you want to translate it into marginal tax rates, which is the way we boring economists think, you have to remember that, okay, it doesn't sound like much, 0.5%. But you have to realize that you have to translate that into what are the annual returns on people's assets. And then you're taking 0.5% of the total amount. You can easily wind up with that 0.5% tax on wealth being equal to a 40% tax on the annual returns to saving and investment. And then when you add in the regular income tax, you add in things like capital gains taxes, corporate income taxes, dividend taxes, you wind up with a system that is very, very harsh, imposes very heavy penalties on the very activity, again, saving and investment, that is so important to growth. So it's a pointless class warfare type of tax. Many European socialist governments learned it was a mistake and got rid of it. And it's really tragic to think that Chile would want to make that mistake, which in reality, it's just going to drive a lot of capital out of the Chilean economy. It's going to go to Panama, Miami, other places.
Did the US ever had something similar, like a wealth tax?
we have never had a wealth tax in the United States. The closest thing we have, and it's a bad tax in and of itself, is we have a death tax, so that if you die with a certain amount of assets, the government will tax your estate before it gets distributed to your heirs. And likewise, I guess you could even consider the capital gains tax a tax on the sale of wealth. But we've never had a direct wealth tax of any sort. Now, some of the far left lawmakers in the US, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they're talking about a wealth tax. And Biden and some other politicians on the Democratic side in the US are talking about a tax on what's called unrealized capital gains. Now, what does that even mean? Well, a capital gains tax is fairly easy to understand. You buy some shares of stock for $100, you sell them later for $200, you have a $100 capital gain. It's a term for the profit on investments that you make. Well, what if you buy $100 of stock, it then increases to $200, you haven't sold it, you don't have any more money in your bank account, but the government says, we're going to tax you on that $100 paper gain. So that, in effect, would almost be a backdoor wealth tax. Now, do I think that has any chance of passing in the current environment in the US? No, fortunately not. A lot of Biden's tax increases, even the ones that are not so damaging, I think they're dead in the water. And the really radical ideas like taxing wealth or taxing unrealized capital gains, I don't think they have a prayer of passing, fortunately.
So I need to correct something I said. I think the wealth tax in Chile is 2.5% over the wealth that exceeds 22 million. Like you have an amount of wealth, they have to measure it, of course. We don't know how they are going to measure it because not everything is so easy to measure, but it's a very radical proposal in that sense. It's 2.5% from what I've seen. I mean, and they expect to increase revenue by 0.5% of GDP by introducing this wealth tax, which is probably not going to work according to what you are telling us. What's the experience according to the experience in other countries?
Well, I have to say, Axel, 0.5% would be bad enough. 2.5% would be absolutely insane, because then if you just have a normal year where your assets increase in value by 5%, and the government's going to come in and tax 2.5% of your entire wealth, you're talking about a 50% tax on your saving and investment, not even counting the regular income tax, the corporate tax, and the other taxes that would be levied. So if Boric and the other politicians in Chile want to drive investors out of the country, if they want to drive saving and investment to other jurisdictions, they're doing it. I can't imagine a policy that would have a worse effect than what they're talking about right there.
And what do you think about the inheritance tax? Because, for instance, we have that in Chile. I think you also have that in the US. And many people argue that it's fair because, people who inherit so much money, they don't deserve it because, their parents made the fortune and not themselves. So it's unfair that they, sons of Elon Musk, get so much money when he dies. What can you tell us about the inheritance tax and the effects that you can observe in the overall economy? Does that really benefit the poor to have an inheritance tax, which is something that they also want to increase now in Chile?
First, let's get a technical point out of the way. What we have in the United States is an estate tax. So the tax is actually levied on the dead person. So if you die with, say, $100 million, the government's going to come in and take a chunk of that money before it then gets distributed to the people in your will. An inheritance tax is when you tax the people getting the money. So the government's taxing the money either way, or the assets either way. It's just, are you taxing the dead person, or are you taxing the people who are in the dead person's will? But in either case, again, what you are doing is you are imposing a tax on saving and investment. Now, I made the mistake of not being born to rich parents, but I don't envy or hate people who have rich parents. I think, well, good luck for them. I mean, they have a step up in life, and I would like to hope of course, I'm getting a lot of gray hair. It's getting too late. I would like to someday become rich myself and leave my children some money to give them a good start in life. But whatever the case, whether you're rich or poor, the idea that taking money from rich people when they die or taking it from their heirs and giving it to government where politicians will misspend it, that does not help the poor. What helps the poor is a vibrant, dynamic, growing economy, creating jobs and opportunity. And that doesn't happen when you're taxing saving and investing, when you're punishing success, when you're demonizing wealth. That's the kind of mentality that I think has caused countries like Greece and Italy to become such basket cases. It's the kind of mentality that turned Venezuela from the richest country in Latin America into to an economic hellhole.
Yeah, and so what can you tell us about the tax system when the United States became the most prosperous nation in the world and the richest country in the world? Let's think about the 19th century, early 20th century. I understand you didn't even have an income tax back then. How was the government funded? How large was the government? And what can we learn from that in the present day?
Yeah, it was not just the United States, North America, Western Europe, the Western world became rich in the 1800s and early 1900s. We went from agricultural poverty to middle-class prosperity. And what was the fiscal policy at the time? Well, for the most part, in all these countries, there was no income tax. We didn't get an income tax in the United States until 1913. England, I guess, had the first one during, I think, the first permanent income tax was, I think, 1841, but I might be wrong on that. In some countries, it wasn't until in the 1920s in the Western world. But the point is that there was no broad-based taxation for the most part all through the 1800s. The burden of government spending was very small, averaging about 10% of GDP. Now, today, we think of places like Taiwan and Singapore as the big free market, small state, low tax jurisdictions, but they have government sectors of about 20% of GDP. So the US, Germany, Japan, England, France, back in the 1800s, outside of wartime, they had government sectors of only 10% of GDP, zero income tax, no broad-based sales taxes or value-added taxes, just a few import taxes and excise taxes on things like alcohol. And when you had that very small government, that's when the economy grew very rapidly. And what really bothers me is that other developing and emerging economies around the world aren't using that same successful path that the Western world got to become rich. Instead, you have bureaucracies like the IMF and the World Bank. They go around the world telling countries to raise their taxes. Well, show me one country anywhere in the world at any point in history that ever went from being poor to rich by imposing higher taxes and enacting a bigger burden of government spending. It's a very anti-empirical approach by some of these international bureaucracies.
Nevertheless, many economists, for instance, in Chile, argue, they are more on the left, that if you take a look at Western Europe after the Second World War, you can see that they were developing fast and they were growing, and you see higher and higher tax burdens. And then they conclude from that if you increase taxation, you develop your economy. And actually, they say, for instance, in the case of Chile, that we are 8 percentage points of GDP lower than the average OECD country in terms of taxation. So if we want to be, similar to what Germany is, or France, or any of these countries, we have to increase taxation, and somehow we will become better, more developed if we do that. What can you tell us about that approach that correlates? Oh, look at the successful countries. They all have sizes of government of 40, 44%. I think Denmark is even over 50%. So we have to do the same thing. And secondly, what do you think of the OECD in general as a role model for this sort of policies?
There's something in the economics literature called Wagner's Law, which is the paradox you just described, which is, why do you have some big government countries like Denmark, like France, that by world standards are relatively rich. And what a lot of people don't understand is, as we were just talking about, those countries became rich when government was very, very small. It wasn't until the mid 1960s that you actually had the big welfare states being adopted. Now, back in the 1930s and around that time, that's when governments put in things like pension systems. And so government went from being 10% of GDP to maybe 15 or 20% of GDP. But after World War II, all the way up into the mid 1960s, government in Western Europe, it was maybe at most 30% of GDP. Now, by today's standards, 30% of GDP in a rich country is considered having a small government. But in the mid 1960s, they started adopting these welfare states, mostly financed by value-added taxes being added on top of income taxes. And then guess what happened? Economic growth began to slow down. So there was a cost to adopting those welfare state policies. There was a cost to making government bigger and adding new taxes on top of the old taxes. But here's the key thing I try to tell people when I'm giving speeches around the world. If you want to copy Denmark and Germany and France and Sweden, go ahead. But make sure you copy them in the 1800s and early 1900s, because that's when they really became rich. And even again, as late as the mid 1960s, they had relatively modest sized governments. And when they adopted the big welfare states, then growth slowed down. So you have to make sure that, we have a saying in the United States, don't put the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
The cart is big government. Now, once the horse of private sector entrepreneurial growth, once the horse got strong enough, these politicians in places like Copenhagen and Berlin and Paris, they adopted these very big, expensive carts. And yes, their economies slowed down, but at least they were already rich countries. There's no way you can be a middle income country, adopt a European style welfare state, and ever become a rich country. You will stop your growth in its tracks if you adopt Western European style statism.
And yet it looks like these countries in Europe, in the United States, have evolved in a way that it's impossible for them to reduce taxes because they have so much government spending and so many so-called social rights, and they have pay-as-you-go systems in terms of pensions and so on and so forth, that you see them desperate to destroy tax competition, and they are creating this global tax for companies that I think it's over 700 million euro per year that they have to pay 15%. You see the so-called tax havens demonized everywhere in the debate. I mean, I lived a long time in Germany. I saw that there. I see that here in Chile. I see that in the United States. It's like the worst thing that can happen is that there are places where you can somehow escape these atrocious fiscal policies, or that are very suffocating for businesses. How do you think the whole thing is going to play out now that interest rates are rising, that is getting more expensive for governments to fund themselves? Maybe not for the US, but also for the US. But you have countries like Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, or even France that probably in a high interest rate environment will have problems sustaining their welfare state.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I forgot to answer the OECD part of your previous question.
Yeah.
And of course, it is the OECD based in Paris that is pushing a lot of these tax harmonization policies. It's the OECD that the high tax nations of the world, they're using the OECD as a vehicle to try to undermine tax competition, to try to penalize and persecute low tax jurisdictions. And this ties in very much with what we were talking about earlier. The United States and France and Germany and other countries like that, we became rich when we had no income taxes and we had very small governments. And now the OECD, in effect, is becoming like an OPEC for politicians. They're trying to create a global tax cartel that will basically criminalize having zero income tax or having low taxes in general. And so they've already had this blacklist where they've penalized and bullied the so-called tax havens. Now they have this proposal that's unfortunately gone a long way toward completion for having a minimum corporate tax rate. And by the way, once that's nailed down for a 15% minimum corporate tax rate, you already have countries like Argentina that are saying that's much too low. It should be 25%. And I'm sure there are people in France that would like it to be, 30 or 40 or 50%. And let me just back up for a second and say something about how tax competition is so good. If you go back to 1980 and you look at top personal income tax rates on households around the world, they averaged nearly 70%. Well, thanks to tax competition, mostly triggered by Reagan and Thatcher slashing tax rates, the average top income tax rate for households or individuals is now in the low 40s. And likewise, if you go back to 1980, the average corporate tax rate was about 48%. Now it's less than 24%. So you can see why politicians are upset. Globalization has been good for taxpayers. It's given people, investors, entrepreneurs, businesses, the ability to shift economic activity to jurisdictions that aren't governed by greedy politicians. Well, the greedy politicians don't like that. And so they're basically using the OECD to try to create this tax collectors cartel designed to penalize taxpayers.
And do you think this process of deglobalization we are experiencing now, with the Cold War 2.0, 2.0, and the trade wars and all of this, is going to make it easier for Western powers to, tax people and companies at higher rates because you will have nowhere to go? Or maybe you will be able, I don't know, to escape to Dubai, and then you will live there as a Westerner, or Singapore, and you will have your companies there. Or I don't know, maybe there will be some frictions with this part of the world that is growing so rapidly, and we will be able to enjoy some benefits of this multipolar world. Or do you think this is not the case?
I think there's definitely a anti-globalization aspect to what's happening in the world today. Some of it is driven by old-fashioned protectionism that we got under Donald Trump, and which Joe Biden has maintained. He has not undone any of Trump's mistakes on trade. But also, some of it is driven by foreign affairs. There's no question that, in part because of what happened with Russia invading Ukraine, but also because of just China's behavior, there's no question that American policymakers, both Republican and Democrat, are now much more leery about economic engagement with China. And I think that's also impacting the decisions of corporations. A lot of companies are thinking, well, maybe it was a mistake to do joint ventures with China. Our intellectual property is being stolen. China's just not behaving the way a civilized country should behave. And there is this sort of pressure when you look at the voluntary actions of companies, along with the new hostile, or maybe not hostile, but skeptical and suspicious viewpoint of politicians. I think we are moving in a direction where there's going to be some decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. And I assume other Western countries also have increased suspicions of what China is doing. Now, that's mostly the fault of China. I don't think President Xi has behaved well in his saber rattling with regards to Taiwan. People are looking at what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, and they're thinking, well, if Xi goes into Taiwan, we're going to have to cut off all Chinese imports. And I think China would deserve that. Now, is that good for the global economy? Of course not. But at some point, national security concerns trump even economic concerns.
And you think this global taxation agenda could survive our Republican administration? Let's say they nail it with the 15% corporate tax globally. You think if, I don't know, Ron DeSantis or whoever, the next president of the United States, going to be, I hope it's a Republican, comes into office, that will last? Because I think it's a sort of unstable, arrangement.
I'm not overly optimistic, and let me give you an example. when the OECD first came out with their blacklist against the so-called tax havens, and they were threatening them with financial protectionism and things like that, that was at the very end of Bill Clinton's presidency. Well, then George W. Bush became president, and through the Center for Freedom and Prosperity and other groups, we were able to sort of pressure the Bush administration not to go along with the OECD agenda. And just like you can't have an oil cartel without Saudi Arabia, you can't have a tax cartel without the United States. So under the Bush administration, the OECD didn't make any progress. But then what happened? Obama got elected. Yeah. And Obama was more than happy to side with the socialists in Europe and elsewhere. And as a result, the OECD basically won their assault on tax havens, and the human right of financial privacy has basically been eroded substantially. Even Switzerland's strong human rights laws no longer protect foreign investors. Now, some of us may have hoped when Trump became president that we could have undone that. We could have gone back to what existed before Obama. Unfortunately, Treasury departments and finance ministries and tax collection agencies around the world, they have tunnel vision. It's all tax collection uber alles. We have to, no matter what you're doing in terms of human rights laws and international relations and trade relations, everything should be contorted and changed in order to facilitate tax collections. And so we, unfortunately, we tried, but we didn't make any progress when Trump was in the White House. Now, might that change with a President DeSantis or some other Republican? I'll certainly do my best to educate them on, not only why the corporate minimum tax should be abolished, but, I'll try to convince them that the U.S. should pull out of the OECD. The OECD started as a relatively harmless bureaucracy that gathered international statistics and, wrote boring research papers and things like that. But ever since it morphed into this sort of, cartel representing big governments around the world, it's unquestionably an economically harmful entity, and it would be good news to defund it or at least stop the U.S. subsidies. And by the way, it's galling, it's disgusting that the OECD bureaucrats go around the world pushing for higher taxes, but by international treaty, they're exempt from paying income tax themselves. That's incredible. I'm almost at a loss for words at the utter grotesque hypocrisy of these international bureaucrats getting very lavish salaries, and yet they're totally immune from the negative effects of the policies they're trying to push on everyone else.
Do you think there is some hope in the economics profession that more economists, coming out from universities will endorse these views and help us spread this message that tax competition is good, that higher taxes are damaging to the economy and to the poorest in the world? Or do you think that's impossible? That free market economists, people who believe in small government, and are a dying species?
The good news is that the economics profession, if you look at academia, economists are more market-oriented than just about any other profession or any other strain of school of thought in the academic world. We're more free market than historians, than economics professors always rank higher than English professors, and so that's the good news. The bad news is it's still a profession, at least in the academy, that leans to the left. Now, they lean to the left in part for cultural reasons. If you ask specific questions, do higher minimum wages destroy jobs? Does rent control cause housing shortages? Is free trade better than protectionism? For the most part, economists will still give good answers. So I think economists, by their very training, especially if they're more micro-oriented, not sort of the macro Keynesian nonsense, I think economists are reasonably sane. Unfortunately, those aren't the economists that get hired by the OECD. Those aren't the economists that go to work for finance ministries and treasury departments, that work for the IMF and places like that. So yes, there are plenty of good economists out there. And by the way, I have a whole collection pro-tax competition quotes from economists who won the Nobel Prize. So there's no question there are a lot of economists who are aware of this issue. They know that, especially the public choice economists, they know that governments have a tendency to grow and grow, and that politicians only think in the short term, and they'll tax and spend their economies into crisis like we see in Italy and Greece, unless there's some sort of external constraint. And what is that external constraint? Tax competition. So we desperately do need to keep tax competition alive, because otherwise there's just a natural tendency on the part of politicians to keep trying to buy votes with more taxes and more spending, and that creates a downward spiral, especially, and this is, I should have mentioned this before, the demographics of the world are changing. Birth rates are falling, people are living longer. And when you have tax and transfer welfare states that were predicated on the notion that there was always a bigger generation of workers to support old people, well, those population pyramids that we all learned about in school, Axel, those population pyramids are becoming population cylinders. And even a modest-sized tax and transfer welfare state becomes unaffordable. And yet politicians, I mean, we see it in the US. Joe Biden wants to expand the entitlements in the US, and we're seeing that in other countries as well. And of course, we're seeing Boric, proposing these ideas in Chile. And when our demographics are changing and birth rates are falling, these policies are economically suicidal in the long run.
How much influence do people still have, like Larry Summers, for example, within the Democratic Party? Because he seems like, okay, it's not a Milton Friedman type of person, free market all the way, but he seems like someone with whom you can have a conversation at least, or he wouldn't endorse MMT, modern monetary theory, and things like that. And he was worrying about inflation, and then inflation happened. And I don't think he would ever say inflation is the fault of corporations having too much profit. And you are seeing Joe Biden and the Biden administration say things that I don't think Democrats a couple of governments ago would have said, not even Obama, probably. I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong. So this sort of economists who are more reasonable within the left, do they still have a voice in what's going on at a government level?
It's funny that you asked that, Axel, because Larry Summers was Bill Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury, and he was a big supporter of the OECD effort. So in my mind, because I have fought against him on these critical issues of tax competition, I've always thought of him as just a leftist. But it turns out that there are people that are farther left than Larry Summers. And the way I've described this to some people is that Larry Summers is like a Swedish social democrat. And Joe Biden's people are like Italian social democrats. What's the difference? Well, Swedish social democrats know 2 + 2 = 4. And they sort of know that at the end of the day, you can't just deficit spend forever. And they know that, well, if you let tax rates get too high, you destroy incentives. So yes, there is some rationality and some good economics, not my economics, but at least relatively sound economics with someone like Larry Summers. Whereas Joe Biden's people, they're like the Italians and the Greeks, or for that matter, they're like the Venezuelans. They're just hard left ideologues, and they just think you can keep, it's almost as if they believe their rhetoric that, oh, government spending's an investment and higher taxes don't have any negative effects on people's incentives. Larry Summers, he might not say it publicly, but privately, I'm sure he knows that if you let tax rates get too high, you wind up hurting the economy. Now, his definition of too high is going to be much, much higher than my definition and your definition of too high, but at least he's semi-rational, whereas the Biden people, I mean, it's really sad because Joe Biden obviously doesn't understand any of this, and yet his administration is basically staffed by the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party.
One fact that I heard you saying in an interview some time ago was that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it used to be the case that 70% or something of the size of total government, local, state, and federal government was mostly local and state government, and 30% was the federal government. And now it's the other way around. Like 70% of the overall size of government is the federal government, and state and local have remained like stable in that sense. What happened? How was that possible? And what are the implications for economic prosperity and for economic freedom?
Yeah, what you're talking about, Axel, is what we refer to in the United States as the issue of federalism or decentralization. And the United States was set up to be like Switzerland, with most governmental activity taking place at the state and local level. And really, the national government was just for things like national defense and a few other minor things. And all the way up until, say, the 1920s, that was the way our government operated. The central government in Washington was relatively small, maybe 3% of GDP, and state and local governments were maybe about 5, 6, 7, 8% of GDP. And of course, this was all during the 1800s and early 1900s, when total government spending was very minor burden, only about 10% of the economy. Well, then what happened in the 1930s under Hoover and Roosevelt? Government basically, the central government basically doubled in size. Then, of course, it increased a lot during World War II, then came back down a lot, but not down to where it was. And ever since the end of World War II, the central government has grown and grown and grown, especially with all the entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the means-tested welfare programs. Now, by the way, state and local governments haven't gotten smaller. They've also gotten bigger, but they've gotten bigger at this rate, and the central government's gotten bigger at this rate. And so as a result, we used to have, again, 70% of government activity taking place at the state and local level, whereas now it's flipped. And I envy the Swiss, because in Switzerland, their system of federalism has still, it still exists. It's still very strong. Most government spending takes place at the level of the cantons and municipalities. And I think that's one of the reasons why Switzerland is one of the most well-run, stable, and prosperous countries in the world. And I would like to think that a new Republican administration after the 2024 election might have a federalism agenda. We didn't get that under Donald Trump, because Donald Trump was just he was a right-wing populist. He didn't really have any underlying free market ideas. I mean, he had certain gut instincts like lower taxes, and I'm glad he had that at least. But he was a big spender. He was a protectionist. There was no cohesive libertarian-minded ideology with him. And hopefully, maybe in 2025, we'll have a new president that might take up that kind of agenda of decentralization, because copying Switzerland would be a very good idea.
One state that, is very popular among not only Americans, but also the international crowd is California. We have seen all the movies coming from California, Silicon Valley, and it's the Golden State and all of that. But it looks like many people are fleeing California and also New York, for that matter, and they are going to Texas or Florida. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there, and why, Elon Musk and I think Oracle and Peter Thiel, all these billionaires who have created so much wealth, and many companies and many regular folks are leaving the state, which was, so attractive and interesting for so many people for so many years?
California, without doubt, is probably the best place to live if you don't have to worry about making money and keeping money. The climate is great. There's so much diversity in terms of geography, mountains, ocean, redwood forest, beautiful deserts. It's really a spectacularly wonderful state to visit. The climate is great. It's sunshine all year round, moderate temperatures, no humidity. There's so much to like about California. Unfortunately, California politicians are taking this beautiful, wonderful, attractive state, and they are making it so that it's really only the very rich and the poor that can afford to live there anymore. A lot of middle-class people are being forced out. And of course, you mentioned that some rich people are leaving too. As of right now, California is still in decent shape, but it's a state that's its public finances are entirely reliant on a narrow, small group of rich people from places like Hollywood and Silicon Valley. Now, if we have a bear market, and so far the stock market this year has not done well, if we have a bear market and capital gains tax revenues disappear, well, California can go from a budget surplus to a budget deficit awful fast. And if you also then have California politicians adopting new bad tax policies, and right now, the top state tax rate is 13.3%. Now, think about that. You can move to Nevada, 0% state income tax. Washington State, just 2 states to the north, 0% state income tax. You can move to Texas or Florida or Tennessee. There's lots of options where you can move where taxes are much, much lower. Arizona, right next door, a low rate flat tax. The more California politicians keep squeezing and squeezing, and of course they have also these anti-growth green policies that make it extraordinarily expensive to build new housing. So what little housing there is, is getting extremely expensive because there's no new supply. So it's just a recipe that's not going to work in the long run, especially when by various national rankings, California has below average schools, they have below average roads. You pay a lot to live in California to the government, and you get basically nothing good in return. And so the question is, you like the climate, you like the topography, you like the vacation opportunities. There's all sorts of things that almost everyone loves about California, but big government is making it less and less attractive every day. And the question is, whenever there's the next downturn, and when the capital gains tax revenues disappear, I do worry about what's going to happen to the state.
Yeah, we're going to see about that. I loved it when I spent there some time, and it's very sad to see, so many people wanting to leave and so many people leaving the state because they can't afford it anymore. But before I let you go, I would like to ask you about the flat tax, because I think you have been a proponent of this flat tax. And what do you make of the argument that progressive income tax is fair? It's most it's a fair tax because you tax richer people more, and then they contribute with the fair share. That's very much part of our tax culture in Chile, and I think everywhere in the world mostly. I mean, people think that the progressive income tax it's not only more efficient, but it's also fair in terms of a moral case for taxation.
I think that argument gets it backwards. If you visit the Supreme Court in the United States, etched above the entrance is the phrase equal justice under law. What does that mean? It means the law should apply equally to everyone. Maybe you've seen, Axel, the statue that represents justice in the United States, where the statue is blindfolded because it's supposed to mean that the law is blind to everything, that the judicial system is blind to anything but the law, so that everyone gets treated equally. Well, what's a so-called progressive tax? It's the idea that government should discriminate on the basis of the level of your income. Not to mention, of course, at least with the American tax code, we have all sorts of discrimination on the sources of your income or the uses of your income. So a flat tax basically says we're going to rip up the 75,000 pages of complicated and corrupt tax code that we have today and replace it with a simple system that treats everyone equally. It doesn't matter how you earn your income. It doesn't matter how you spend your income. And it doesn't matter the level of your income, one low rate with no double taxation and no loopholes. Now, by the way, that's the system that Hong Kong has had ever since World War II. Now, whether China allows it to continue and what the future of Hong Kong is, maybe I'm not so optimistic, but that flat tax system has worked wonderfully for decades. And it's not there's nothing magical about having one rate. The key thing is having low rates and no double taxation and no distorting loopholes. So if someone said, Dan, you can have a progressive system with rates of 10% and 15% and 20%, or you can have a flat tax of 30%. Well, obviously, I'll take the so-called progressive system. The key thing is you want tax rates on productive behavior to be low, because why would you want to penalize people for creating wealth for the economy? Now, I oftentimes will promote the flat tax because of the assumption that it is based on having low rates. But if someone says, oh, I'll have a flat tax with a rate of 80%, well, then all of a sudden I say no.
Of course. So in your ideal world, you would only have a flat tax. That would be it. Like one single tax system. You wouldn't have VAT. Of course, you wouldn't have inheritance tax. You wouldn't have wealth tax. You wouldn't have probably tariffs and things like that. You would have this flat tax on income, and that would be it.
Well, if we're talking about my ideal world, Axel, then I'm thinking, let's go back to the fiscal policy of the 1800s, where we didn't need any tax whatsoever, any broad-based national tax, because central government was only spending 2 or 3% of GDP. Now, yeah, okay, maybe that's a fantasy world. So let's be a little bit more realistic. Yes, I would prefer getting rid of the income tax system we have now, replacing it with a flat tax. Now, by the way, the flat tax also applies to business income. So both labor income and capital income are taxed once at one low rate. Now, there is another big tax in the United States, by the way, that we should mention, and that's the payroll tax. As a matter of fact, 3/4 of Americans pay more in payroll tax than they pay in income tax. And that payroll tax finances Social Security and Medicare. And what we want to do with the payroll tax is to adopt a Chilean or Australian style pension system. Now, of course, Boric wants to get rid of your system in Chile, which is just amazing, especially given the demographic changes that we were just talking about. Why any country would consider going back to a pay-as-you-go system that with a population cylinder instead of a pyramid is guaranteed to lead to fiscal disaster. So we want to copy the Chilean system at the same time that Boric and others want to copy the Italian system. So hopefully we succeed in our efforts and Boric fails in his efforts.
Let's hope so. So Daniel, thank you very much for being with us, and I hope to talk to you soon again, because I fear that they might get away with the tax reform and also with the new constitution, which will be even worse for the country than the tax reform. And I know you have been following the Chilean case for decades, and you are one of the people outside Chile who really appreciate what we have achieved. And yeah, I assume you will be following what happens in next year as well. So we'll be happy to have you back.
Well, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. When is that referendum on the new constitution? September?
September 4th, yeah.
Okay, well, please defeat it.
Yeah, we'll do everything we can. But it's up to the people in the end, and it will be interesting to observe anyways. So thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
El Líbero, la realidad como no la habías visto.
Haz que estos contenidos lleguen más lejos haciéndote miembro de la Red Líbero.